Jim Milligan tonight because Jim is actually taking a rare but probably much enjoyed vacation.
Oh, wow.
I know, oh wow, it's exactly right. So this is our second Thursday of the month program by the Concord Historical Society. This program throughout the year is sponsored by the Walker Lecture Series, and we're super excited to have them as a partner. They are so profoundly interested in history, and we, of course, are so interested in telling that story. Last month, our very good friend Dick Osborne wasn't able to make our last minute meeting, but we had a great time doing stories out of the hat. And of course, we decided this time that he needed to come because we didn't have a backup. So we dragged him here in order to do his presentation. And I know that people were very interested in hearing all about our media history. And so without further ado, Dick Osborne.
Thank you all, and thank you for coming. It's fun to go back and look at things that have occurred over the years, some of which none of us, I dare say, were alive at that time. But here we are. So I'm not going to talk about largely the computer age of news gathering and presenting. I'm not going to talk about the scourge of COVID-19, which had such a negative impact on the news industry. And I will talk about what is the chapter of our book, Cross Currents of Change, which I hope you've had a chance to look at and buy if you haven't already. I think back to about 2009 when we were, well, no, it was before that, about 2007, I guess, when Jim Milligan, the president still of our Historical Society, and Steve Winship, great reporter that he was and journalist, now passed on, and several others of us sat down and decided it was time that we wrote a 20th century history of Concord. And so what we're talking about tonight is sort of a history of journalism and a history of the evolution of Concord's media. And back in the early part of the 20th century, the first 2 decades, the media was a lot different than it is today, needless to say. It was a man who became a U.S. senator, and senators were elected by the legislature at that time, George Moses, if that name rings a bell, and he was succeeded by William E. Chandler, and there was a William D. Chandler as well. They were all very, very political. They were Republicans. They were white, they were male, they were Republicans. Lots happened since then. The Republican Party is a little bit different. In 1923, William Chandler sold the business, sold the paper, and it went to the Langleys. Jim Langley was editor for 45 years. And during that time, he had a tremendous impact on the city. It was the era of the editor civic leader. And I'll get into that in a little bit here. One defining chapter of the story about the media is to talk about the mayor. Anybody here have remembrances of Mayor Quinn?
I think we've all heard of him.
Well, I laugh. But Mayor Quinn was elected in 1965. He served for a year and a half before he was impeached and thrown out of office by the Board of Aldermen, strong mayor's form of government at that time. And Concord has had sort of a ping-pong relationship with its form of government. Twice it's had city manager, professional executive experience by specialists, and it's had at other times a strong mayor form of government. Well, certainly Quinn qualifies for the latter. But he was elected to the legislature once, and he was also the first chair of the Public Housing Commission, the Concord Housing Commission. This was in the early 60s. And his claim to fame was that he helped to build and get approval for the Boucher Apartments in Pennacook and what became the JFK apartment building on South Main Street in Concord. And then he decided he was going to run for mayor. And his tenure was, you can put up Mayor Quinn now. Oh, here's Mayor Quinn. He was a handsome devil. Charmer. He really was a charmer. And initially, he had the approval of the editor of the paper, Jim Langley, because he was calling for open meetings. The finance committee meetings of the city of Concord were closed to the public. And Quinn picked that up as an issue early on, that he wanted to open the meetings. So Langley, being a journalist, was on the right side of this issue as well. And he supported Quinn in that regard. But they had a falling out. Concord has a would-be dictator at City Hall, an imperious incompetent who thinks the government became his personal property when he was elected as mayor. That was Jim Langley's editorial at one point during the controversy. There were a lot of controversies. Let us say that Quinn's relationship with the city board of aldermen was tumultuous, without any question. Finally, to make a long story short, and it is a long story, there was a move to investigate Well, first of all, Quinn wanted to investigate the police department, which had a $40,000 fund that Quinn claimed should have been given to the Concord Boys Club. I think it was the Boys Club, not the Boys and Girls Club at that time. At any rate, it came down to a battle between the two entities, the Board of Aldermen and Mayor Quinn. And really, that's what it was, because the votes against Quinn in the various iterations of this controversy, it was one-sided. It came down to a final vote, 2 nights of hearings on the removal of Quinn. They voted overwhelmingly to remove Quinn as mayor. And I didn't even say his first name, did I? Well, it was J. Herbert Quinn. Not his first name, but his middle name is what he went by. So they removed him from office. It went to court. The judge sitting in Merrimack County Superior Court ordered him reinstated. And the judge, notably, was Hugh Bounds, who became a very, very distinguished member of the judiciary. Then it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, you're right, you can order Quinn to step aside. Well, when they voted to remove Quinn, the final vote in August of 1967, there was an angry crowd outside City Hall. Is anybody there? Anybody who's here there? No? Well, there was fear by the members of the Board of Aldermen that if they went out the front door, they might meet with physical resistance. So they were all ushered out the back door of City Hall. The city council chambers being above or next to the police station today, in those days, in the 60s, City Hall was on, the city aldermanic chamber was on the second floor of City Hall. One big room, since has been cut into various offices. So the Board of Aldermen, they were protected, and the next year was spent with the debate over whether to change the city's form of government, and it was changed at that point to city manager, council form of government. Then later on, earlier rather, it had been a city manager as well. So let's now go back to Langley. And Quinn was such a likable fellow, but Langley was not. As a matter of fact, Quinn pinned a name on him that a lot of people agreed with. The old grouch. The old grouch's leadership of Concord went deep, deep into the community. There hasn't been anybody quite like him ever since. But just to cite a few of the things Have I got number 3, 4? Actually, let's skip 1 and go to the hospital board picture. That's Jim Langley in the middle, seated, looking like an old grouch. And it's a typical photo of Concord, but there is one woman, and I don't know who it was. Does anybody know who that would be? No? Well, she's not identified in the book either. But this is the original Concord Hospital Board of Trustees. The Pillsbury Hospital and the Women's Hospital had been deemed inadequate at that point, and Jim Langley really led the effort to build the hospital. Foresighted, yes. Knew what he wanted, absolutely. Able to marshal the executives of the biggest companies and most prominent people in the city, and he did it. That was one thing he did. He was very interested in planning. He got an enabling act, which was passed by the legislature, and it laid the basis for municipal planning and state planning. He was behind the establishment of the State Office of Planning. He was the first chairman of the Concord Planning Board, and really was responsible for, as well, for bringing Gus Layton into the city. Now, somebody must be here who remembers Gus Layton. No? Let's see, I came on the board of the planning board in 1972. And Gus Layton was still the planning director at that time. Concord was the first municipality that had a planning department, that had a professionally led planning department. In addition, he was the first president, Langley was, of the Concord Community Chest to raise money for charities that were established in a broad way through the community. He was the first president of the Concord Regional Development Corporation, which of course went on to market successfully a whole lot of buildings and municipal development on the Heights along Regional Drive and that area. He was on the executive committee originally of the Daniel Webster Council of the Boy Scouts. Have I missed anything here? Oh, yes. What became Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Hampshire, Vermont, was the New Hampshire Hospitalization Board. And guess who ran that? Jim Langley. He backed Eisenhower in his run for the presidency in 1952, and he was rewarded with an ambassadorship. The country was Pakistan, a new country at that time, and I'm not sure that Langley was actually called, that his title was ambassador. but that's what it says. And I wrote that chapter of the book, so I must have been right, I guess. Langley was also a big fan of Sherman Adams. He was the governor of New Hampshire at that time. And I guess his partisan political activity on behalf of Eisenhower and on behalf of Adams probably led to that ambassadorship, or whatever we call it. But Langley was also a staunch Republican. He editorialized regularly against FDR's New Deal policies and proposals. He editorialized against the labor movement in the lee of World War II. And finally, in 1961, after he'd been there for just shy of 40 years as the editor and such a strong voice, he sold the paper. It was a surprise to all of the employees at that time. And at that point, there was a lot of labor unrest, and I'm sure that his editorial stands contributed to the fact that a strike occurred. It was a bitter, bitter strike by the International Topographers Union. And really, they wanted to go back and continue in a contract the antiquated printing of the paper. The Monitor was owned by the Rumford Press, or by the families, the Chandler families, and controlled then. The Rumford Printing Company, just down the block here, was one of the largest employees in the city. Fondly remembered, I think, by its employees, without any question. The strike finally, after a couple of years, began to peter out. But if we can go back one now, anybody know who that is? That's Percy Lister, the publisher of the Concord Shoppers News. He had been a typographer operator for the Monitor. He'd worked for the Monitor for 30 years, but went on strike, walked the picket line, and a paper had been started that was really just an advertising sheet called the Concord Shoppers News by a gentleman named Nadeau. And it was then sold, and the Listers bought it. This is Percy and his wife. Althea, yes. From 1964 to 1969, Percy owned the Concord Shoppers News. It was still basically a, I'd say up to 20 pages of almost totally advertising. But there was a column in the Shoppers News that was very political, and it was written by one James Shadlick. Anybody remember Jim Shadlick? He owned the Neopco Sign Company. but he also was virulently against the Board of Aldermen. Quinn was his creation, I guess, in some parts, although I'm sure Herb Quinn wouldn't necessarily agree with that characterization. At any rate, the Monitor was separated from the Rumford Press, separated from the Republican Press Association, which had been the owner of the Monitor prior to Langley's succession to the throne. Then, as the story went along, Jim Langley surprised all the employees, as I said a moment ago, by selling the paper. But he continued writing editorials from 1961 to 1968. The family that bought the papers was the Dwight family of Massachusetts. One of the Dwights subsequently was a lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. And one of them, notably, had married into the Dwight family. Langley continued for 7 years to be editor, wrote all the editorials, but under the Dwight ownership, the Monitor became a much different paper. It didn't get involved in projects for the betterment of the community. Oh, there were occasional editorials that would be published pushing for one thing or another in terms of municipal benefits. But instead, the paper evolved, and thus the title of the program, into a much different publication. The people who had been its stable of writers, they were talented, they were diggers of fact, and they had a very good reputation. There was a Colonel Baker. Anybody remember Colonel Baker? No? Boy, it's such a young audience. Andy Anderson reported on State House affairs and was really the dean of the press corps. Andy then went on, after retirement in 1967, he went on and wrote a history of the New Hampshire legislature. Rule Colby was a terrific writer, a sports editor of the Monitor. But all these people who had been around Langley had been his reporters and columnists from 1920. Well, Andy Anderson was there in 1926 and stayed until 1961. That's quite a record. Some of the new faces that came in, and if we can skip 2 and go to George Wilson, as I say, he was one of the Dwight clan who he married Marley. And it's really a puzzle to me as to how much influence in those early days George Wilson had on the paper. But it certainly was overall in the positive. He hired a whole bunch of real good people. Bob Lockwood in the newsroom, Jack Gifford, Scott Blakey, Joe Fitzgerald. When Rule Colby retired as the sports editor, they had to get somebody really good, because Rule Colby was a terrific writer. If you ever have a chance and want to just spend some time going back into the archives of the Monitor on microfilm or something, whatever we're using today, look up some of the columns that Rule Colby wrote and some of the columns that his successor, Joe Fitzgerald, wrote. Joe Fitzgerald went on to the Boston Herald and co-wrote several books with, typically with athletes who couldn't write worth a damn. And so Joe Fitzgerald had to be real good, and he was. Let's see, where am I here? Well, I don't know how much influence Marley Wilson, George's wife, had on the paper, because she was a Dwight. But she certainly had some. But I think George Wilson, who was appointed to be the general manager of the paper. By the way, George Wilson worked for the Washington Post. You know, the famous Washington Post style section, which it was in its early days when George Wilson was responsible for it. And they don't claim that George Wilson had a major part in the style section itself. I haven't been able to find that, but he got a terrific grounding by being an employee of the Post. Then there was a new editor who was hired when Langley left, and that was Tom Gerber. I'm all messed up. Another one forward. There's Gerber. Boy, I thought he was a terrific editor. Anybody remember Tom? Yeah? He was a tough guy. He was a tough editor, which was good. He was recruited by the Wilsons, the Dwights, to come up and succeed Langley. And he was another one who had to be pretty darn good. But he changed the tone of the paper, too. It was during those first years after Langley retired. And Gerber changed the whole tone of the paper, emphasizing that it should become here's Bill Dwight, new owner, and Tom Gerber, the new general manager, were both endowed with a spirit of public service. Langley editorialized, like us, they believe a paper has considerable responsibilities to the public. If we have been able to measure up to some of these obligations, we know they will do so they will do so to an even greater extent. The Monitor will become an even better paper in its years ahead. Well, I dare say that's true. The depth of the Monitor, the depth of the management and the reporting that came here was really pretty remarkable. In 1977, the Mike Pride era began. Of course, the paper won a Pulitzer in 2008, and I said I wasn't going to go back that far, but anyway. Mike had been the city editor at the Tallahassee Democrat, not to be confused with a partisan term, Democrat. I don't know what he was, probably independent. And a whole new group of people came on either just before or during the editorship of Mike Pride. It became a paper that journalists probably had a good laugh about. They said you could go to work for the Monitor, I'm paraphrasing, and win awards, or you could go for the Union Leader and get good wages. I don't know how true that is, but I think it has a kernel of truth. If there was somebody here who worked for the Union Leader, they probably could verify that. Some of the people who were recruited for the paper, and now we can go back to Rod Paul.
This guy?
Right. Rod was a character. I remember when he was in the press room of the State House. Do they still have a press room?
They do.
They do?
Yes, they do.
It's a wonder. But anyway, Thompson came down and ranted and raving about socialists being given free rein to walk around in the State House. And Rod Paul said, he was gesticulating at me. Well, anyway, Rod was a character. He had a little problem, gambling. But boy, what a terrific State House reporter he was. Bob Norling recently passed on. Bob was a great editor. And then there were people like in the brought on by Mike Pride, like Steve Pearlstein, 2008 winner of the Pulitzer Prize for economic reporting. Floyd Norris, Joe Fitzgerald again came and was succeeded by a pretty good guy too. Let's see. In the year 2000, the paper moved. And let's see. If we actually go down to number 12, which is the Monitor staff. This is the staff of the Monitor, largely, in 1990. And It's the year that the Monitor moved from 3 North State Street up to the banks of the Merrimack River. I'm sure some people, well, a lot of people were not too happy with all that. I think given the times that 1990 represents, it was not a bad thing to have it moved to new quarters. But some people were unhappy. Somebody asked me if that was Dan Habib in the middle, down at the bottom of the photo, and yes, it is. Ralph Jimenez, who you sometimes read something by, was longtime editorial writer for the Monitor, is second from the top with a beard. I don't remember all these people by any means, but it was sort of a traumatic experience, I think, for the reporters who'd been based downtown and then were moved out to the hinterlands of East Concord. In 1992, the paper became a AM publication. Instead of being the Concord Evening Monitor, it was the Concord Monitor, and it was published in the afternoon. Somewhere around the mid-70s and on into 1986, there was a new paper that was published out of Concord called the New Hampshire Times. Now I'm getting to the point that somebody's going to say, yes, I remember the New Hampshire Times. David Harris does. It was a great tabloid-sized paper. When we published this 20th century history, John Milne was the editor of the book. He was also the editor of the New Hampshire Times during that mid-70s through 1986 period. They had some great reporters. A lot of them had come over from the Monitor. And unfortunately, the paper didn't make it. And it ceased publication in 1986. But they were, I guess you'd say, muckrakers. If there was a muckraking media in Concord, it was the New Hampshire Times. Okay. In 1946, Charles Dale was the governor, and he didn't like what the Monitor had to say about him. Not at all. And so he applied for and received a license for an AM station. A little sidebar here about the allocation of frequencies, broadcast frequencies by television and radio. That became WKXL when Charlie Dale applied for it. He wanted to have a voice that would be less critical, shall we say, than Langley and the crew had been. And so WKXL went on the air in June of 1946. The sidebar is that when Quinn was impeached and thrown out of office, the station, WKXL, carried the broadcast of the 2 nights of hearings and the eventual vote to remove him from office, Quinn. The station broadcast it live from City Hall. They had been broadcasting city council or aldermanic meetings anyway, but on that occasion, those 2 nights, the ratings went through the roof. The station was 500 watts, 250 at night, because at sunset you had to turn the power down to half of what it had been. The streets of Concord, from Pennacook on down into the city, the station's tower was located on Reddington Road, where it is now. And because there was no reception in Pennacook or that part of the city, which was really a stronghold of Quinn, of his era, so the streets were lined with cars. People were listening to their radios so they could hear what the heck was going on there at City Hall. Well, gave a boost to WKXL, but the station was located on North Main Street in the so-called Eagle Annex. I believe it's upstairs over Papanusick Mills now. When Duncan McGowan was involved in the Eagle Hotel renovation, Eagle Annex renovation, he called me and said, would you like to see what WKXL's studios look like? Because I'm about to destroy them, as part of the, fact that he was doing actually a great thing for the city, architecturally. And at any rate, it was moved in 1957. The studios left and went up to where the transmitter tower is on Reddington Road. And the station was bought by one Frank Estes, who I went to work for in 1966. Stayed there for about 35 years until we sold the station. Estes gave us the opportunity to buy him out. And so a group of employees, 7 people originally, went in on the deal and bought stock in the station. We had quite a run as well. Among the people that I hired who went on to notable careers, David Malpas was the very first. Well, first of all, I should say that the group of employees we had, largely from the Concord area or Concord itself, was pretty remarkable. People like Gardner Hill, Jim Janot, Don Dunkley, just to name a few. Here's one member of part-time staff sitting over here in the audience, David. Jackie Judd went on to NPR, then became a first-line reporter for CBS out of Washington. Barry Bagnano worked for CBS. Tim Clark went on to be executive editor of Yankee Magazine. Barry Leibowitz became a lawyer. Scott Horsley Washington bureau chief for NPR for a couple of years. So we had assembled people from out of town, those that I read just now, and there were others. Randy Goldberg, Bob Oakes, Jim D'Souza, Lisa Schweitzer, Ruth LaFantasy, but KXL, as we call it, was the only game in town, broadcast-wise. It existed from 1946 until 1981. There were no other radio stations or television stations in the city. And at that point, it was New Hampshire Public Radio, WEVO, as we used to call it, WEVO, started in 1981, had a statewide focus and still does. Mark Handley became a general manager who ran WEVO with a classical music and jazz format and folk. Folk is the only thing that remains today, as it's become a real journalistic entity. WJYY came on the air in 1983, WNNH in 1989, not all of them licensed to Concord, but to they programmed themselves to Concord. That was their orientation. In 1984, wait a minute, let's go back a little bit before that. Channel 21, WNH-TV, was put on the air in April of 1984 by Francis and Robert Shane. It was sold to the Flatley Company, a company that still has a presence in Concord, is the owner of the Rumford Press, the former Rumford Press building down here. It was sold for $5 million to the Flatley Company. They got an affiliation with CBS Television, invested in the newsroom in 1988, tried to make a go of it against Channel 9, had a real tough time. They had a professional staff. They were pretty darn good for a short period of time, but they left the air on March 31st, 1989, and that's the last time that Concord, other than cable, had a television station over the air licensed by the FCC. Then came the era of cable TV, and there was a fight for the franchise. Frank Estes applied for it, and a company called Telecable Inc. had a familiar address, 3 North State Street, was awarded the license. They had a 12-station system. Telecable sold out to Continental Cablevision, then, or rather now, the child of Xfinity. Continental sold to AT&T in 1995, and that became eventually Xfinity. But in the meantime, in the earliest years, when it was a local presence, at least, that owned the system, Concord had what amounted to a cable, news, and sports kingdom, if you will. John Graffair, who passed on a year ago and was our executive director at the Concord Historical Society, was a mainstay of that. Greg Euchran was the one who sold a lot of advertising, created a lot of the programming, high school, sports, a major contribution to our record of the Challenger disaster in '86. Greg said when we were getting ready to write the book, or when I was writing this chapter, he said, you know, this was really the golden age of media in Concord, and it really was. That mid-80s, give or take a couple of years, on into the mid-90s. And it seems to me, although I'm prejudiced and old, that's true. And what we've had since, although we had no influence over COVID, and we've had no influence over the social media. It's a lot different picture out there today than it used to be. I, for one, am not feeling that it has treated the media well, or that the media has treated its communities well. And with that, I guess that's about all I have to say. But it's been a pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry if I've kind of fumbled around here for things. What else have I got? That's Jackie Judd, who is with CBS and ABC. She was on the air most every night as the lead on the ABC News with Peter Jennings. Scott Horsley, what a terrific guy. Who have I missed here?
Ed Bruder worked for JYY for a long time.
Yeah, well, Ed went on to have quite a career in broadcasting and also as a producer. Mm-hmm. To be.
Wysocki was with you, wasn't he? Dave Wysocki?
Yeah, he sure was. And I see Dave quite a bit today. He was with AP for a long time. And Randy Goldberg left and went to Detroit to AP. Guess I mentioned her. We used to have, when Blake's turkey farm was raising turkeys, we used to send the newest reporter out to the turkey farm to get the best story they could on the turkey farm about a week before Thanksgiving. Every year we did that. We sent whoever the new newbie was, we'd send them out to the turkey farm.
Excellent.
Anybody else have any questions at all? Comments? Criticisms?
I got a question. I didn't know the history with Langley as much,
Yeah.
but he was very active and very editorial. Do you think that influenced Loeb to do what he did, or Loeb was his own man? Loeb came in and now, 46, and Langley had been at it for 20 plus years.
Yeah. No, I don't think so.
Not connected.
No, I really don't.
Different ends of the
Some
spectrum.
people might say yes. I think the Monitor sometimes had ambitions, not sometimes, but quite a bit, had ambitions to run ahead of the Union Leader and become the statewide newspaper, or one of two. But there was only room for one, really, in this market, not two.
Dick, I have a question. How did you end up in Concord and at WKXL? What brought you here?
Well, I came here because on my undergraduate years, I went to St. Lawrence and had a degree in government. And I went to graduate school at Boston University School of Public Communication. I broadcast hockey games for one season when Jack Parker was a freshman and couldn't play because freshmen didn't play college hockey. Then we went back to Syracuse. I got married and we went back to Syracuse, where I came from. Went to work for WHEN Television as a salesperson. Hated it. Everybody was dissatisfied with working there, too. A whole bunch of people were just put their foot in the door and shuffle along as best they could. But nobody was happy at that place. So I wrote letters to a bunch of stations that I had come in contact with when I was at BU in graduate school, and had a job part-time working for a company that sold advertising regionally, a rep firm, they called it, station representative. And went to work for a terrific guy, George Bingham. And I wrote letters to a bunch of stations that he represented and said, I have an interest in working for you and so forth. And almost went to work for WMTW Radio, the first real successful FM radio station. But I didn't. I went to Concord instead to work for Frank Estes, and I made $85 a week. I said, that's not enough. My wife had worked at the radio station in college, St. Lawrence, and so she had some familiarity with the business, and they were looking for a traffic manager to schedule. Well, you can imagine what a traffic manager does. And so he hired her for $65 and me for $85, and away we went. Anything else? David?
At some point, didn't WKXL publish a morning newsletter?
Oh, gosh, yes. Yeah, I forgot that. One sheet.
8.5 by 11 sheet of paper.
That's right. And it had all the stories that we could gather, typically previews of city meetings, and the police blotter and the fire blotter.
And how was that distributed?
By a gentleman named John Harrington, who handed them out. We paid him, I'm not sure what we paid him.
$95 a week, I would think.
Wasn't that much, I'll tell you that. I think maybe we paid him with coffee. He was sort of an eccentric fellow, but anyway, we printed, I think, like 350 of those. The Monitor being an afternoon paper at that point, we had the morning to the KXL morning news sheet. And we took pride in putting together the best we could on one 8.5 by 11 mimeographed sheet. And that lasted until, oh gosh, I don't know. When did JYY go on the air again? 1983? 83, so it must have gone at least through the mid-70s. That's how that came to be. Yes?
Wasn't there a name Jim Janot?
Jim Janot?
Yeah.
Yes. I mentioned Jim. He went on to be, not went on, but he was elected Sportscaster of the Year in New Hampshire, I think 17 years in a row, something like that. Great guy, grew up on Oak Street, up by the Federal Building. Yeah, and we had in high school sports, and Jim and I put together the UNH Sports Network, which operated for quite a few years with other stations around the state who carried UNH as well. But Jim was a great sportscaster. I believe he's up in Heritage Heights now. Yeah.
We're just a few minutes over 8 o'clock.
Got another one, David?
Well, there are two other radio stations that signed on in the 20th century, I think.
Right.
I didn't hear you mention WSPS.
Oh, no, I don't think,
90.5
St. Paul School.
at the time. And you didn't mention WKXL FM.
no. It went on the air in 1972.
Early 70s, yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a classical music library in the station. Was that for KXL FM to
No,
use the?
there was a controversy. WCRB in Boston
Was on the adjacent frequency.
was on an adjacent frequency. We had one place that we could locate our tower, our transmitting tower, and that happened to be on the Misco's land up on Little Pond Road. And that is where we finally located the FM, but at that time we were the only state capital city to which no FM allocation had existed. All the other state capitals in the country had them, and it was a long fight. I remember how many years it took Frank to get that FM allocation. And think what happened now. Stations are owned, 1,000 stations by one entity. Not different. Charlie.
One story I remember, Dwight and Beth, on April Fool's Day, pulled a fake parade on the Heights, doing a live broadcast with background noise from a parade, and people went up to watch the parade, and they just barely held on to their job. Is that a true story?
I believe that's slightly embellished.
Okay,
Slightly, not much.
not much.
But I think we called a state holiday once on April Fool's Day. And people were advised that they didn't have to go to their jobs. Well, we caught hell from that. That was the woman that was the program director at the FM side, Blake. Renee Blake, thank you.
I wasn't part of that.
Well, I guess not. We'd have an investigation going. All right, it's been my pleasure, really.
Thank you very much. So we are at the end of the year for our second Thursday of the month programs. In December, we all take the holidays off, and we'll be back in January. We are already working to line up a whole series of new events for 2025. The one thing I would say to you is that, well, special thanks to the Walker Lecture Series for sponsoring us, Concord TV for always coming to record our sessions. 2026 is a very big year in the United States of America. It's the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, when we said bye-bye to our British friends, and also the 300th anniversary of when our king in Britain said that New Hampshire and several of our towns could separate from Massachusetts. So 2026 is going to be a big year. Concord Historical Society is working with the city of Concord to create a bunch of celebrations and things that we can all come together and celebrate these two really significant events that are happening in 2026. So listen more for that. And thank you so much for coming tonight. We very much appreciate it.